So that's a great point. If I could go down that tangent a little bit, the the idea. I mean, I think about the sort of athletes that I've supported over the years, and I'm sure you have. And you think about the ones that, oh, we've put a great season together, and it's no wonder because they've stayed injury free, and therefore they're on the, they've been able to get the most out of themselves, and they've got the results that they want. And it's easy for us to skip over those seasons where they've missed out. They've picked up an injury. They've got overtrained in the classic term, at least. And I think about the limiting factors. So ultimately, I guess for an elite athlete, if you never get injured or you never get overtrained, you've probably never pushed that boundary of recovery. But what about this idea of trying to get more bang for your buck from a training stimulus? Because of the whole wave of recovery modalities increasing number of ice baths per week, and people saying, I've upped my training intensity, I've upped my training volume, but they're not necessarily fitter, where it might be shortcutting the sort of adaptive response. That always got me thinking more about, well, how could you increase the training response from a gene transcription response and encoding and so on for less stimulus? Like I'm thinking about hypoxia, I'm thinking more about blood flow restriction, of intensifying the cell signal, but without necessarily damaging the tendons or the bones as much. What's your sort of feeling around that sort of area about to exploit that for athletes?
Yeah, I think that we've done a little bit of that, and I can't claim to be an expert on that, but I think you're right. I think probably going back to the early discussion where we were talking about the avoiding those plateaus and things like that. I think probably early on it's not much of an issue, and I think sometimes athletes can make the mistake of trying to introduce some of those things too early, whereas I think more when you're approaching a plateau is when, in my view, when that's probably more appropriate. And I think you're right. I think you've done a really nice job. You must do a few of these podcasts of, tying those things together in that as you get training, like as you get more trained, how do you maintain that training stimulus? And there probably comes a point where, it's difficult to increase the intensity without having some sort of, classic inverted U, having some sort of risk of breakdown, getting sick or whatever. And then it becomes to, okay, is there another way that I can stress my muscles, my system to continue those adaptations? And so I think, we've done a little bit of work with blood flow restriction. So that's definitely a way where you can increase, I guess, the metabolic stress on the muscle. Hypoxia potentially is another way that you can do that as well. So I think those areas are definitely ripe for looking into. I think one of and I think it's a classic issue in our field, is at least when obviously like the stuff that we do with the muscle and the molecular responses, we're not doing it on elite athletes who are close to the plateau. And so I think sometimes when we're doing it with more moderately trained people, they're at that phase where any stimulus is going to be quite stressful. And so sometimes maybe that's why we don't see the differences we might expect to see, because it's easy enough to stress those people. But I agree with you. I think as we're getting closer to the elite athletes, then other ways of increasing the exercise stress that don't increase the risk of breaking down are definitely worth pursuing.
Mm. We had lots of different crazy ideas about trying to be able to broach that conundrum of getting good observations on elite athletes. This was back when I was in the Olympic system, but it was hatched this idea that as athletes started to come to the end of their career, you probably need to be a little bit more experimental, and potentially when they've retired, that would be a great opportunity to kind of keep them fit, transition them out of the sport. They could still stay engaged, but ultimately you start guinea pigging them a little bit. And even though they might be 35, 39, the older end of the spectrum, it would access, a very specific genome. That was our idea for it, but we never quite got it off the ground. Couldn't find any funding for it.
And I think, yeah, I mean, obviously I'm a physiologist and not a psychologist, but there's probably also just, you know, the variety, the value in introducing different types of, I mean, I imagine, you know, not too many athletes miss training when they retire. So I think, I imagine at the end, as they're getting closer to the end of their career, if there's other ways that you can introduce some of those things from a physiological point of view, but also there's probably a psychological motivational aspect there as well.
And just going back to that consistency and keeping people training, one of the sort of cycles that I've experienced often with athletes, particularly when they've been broken, overtraining or particularly injury, and then we start introducing, say for example, in running, a classic example where the training volume just isn't as much because the limiting factor there tends to be breakdown of bone or connective tissue and so on, rather than immune stress. And then we start putting them, we do aqua jogging, we do cross trainer, we do some bike sessions, might do some work in hypoxic chambers to up the physiological stress without having to stress the bone or the impact side of things, or alter G treadmills, these sorts of things. I'm one of the questions I've got for you is about how transferable you sense the overall stimulus might be, even though the recruitment of the muscles might be slightly, or actually quite different for a different mode of exercise, say an elliptical cross trainer versus running. What's your sense of how transferable that is at a cellular level? If you're recruiting the muscle, you're recruiting the muscle, or is it quite specific to the recruitment pattern and pool that you use?
Yeah, I suspect it is quite specific. Exactly how specific, I'm not sure. I mean, I think at the the really broad level, and they have done some studies. If you do leg exercise and take a biopsy of the arm, nothing's changing the mitochondria in the arm because those arm muscles. So I mean that's quite different when you got completely different limbs. We just published last month a paper in Nature Communications where we did some single fiber proteomics, and we saw when we did the moderate intensity, nearly all the adaptations were in the type 1 fibers. So even though the type 2 fibers are going to be sitting right alongside the type 1 fibers, they're not going to be, a lot of the time they're not going to be contracting. They're not going to have the metabolic changes that the slow twitch fibers are having. And so we didn't see much change, at least in the proteins in those fast twitch fibers when we did low to moderate intensity exercise. So I suspect I suspect that you're going to get the best adaptations when it's more specific. There'll still be some overlap, like you said, if you're going from running to an elliptical trainer or whatever. There's going to be some muscles in common, but there's probably also going to be some muscle fibers that are a little bit different. So I think you'll still get some adaptations, but probably not quite to the same level if you're doing a more specific and you're recruiting the same muscle fibers that you're going to be using in the actual exercise task, whatever the performance of that athlete is.